Okay, hello everyone. Thanks a million for coming along today. Particularly, thank you very much, Graeme. And it's an honor to have you here today. I think this is such an interesting topic and couldn't get much better to a person to discuss it with. Pretty sure most people who are here are already going to be familiar with Graeme and his work, but for anyone who's not familiar with him, this is Professor GraemeClose, who is a professor of human physiology at Liverpool John Moores University. Graeme has a fairly huge and extensive portfolio of research in physiology and nutrition-based research, but he also has a huge amount of applied experience working with a wide range of professional teams and elite athletes. So in terms of the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is the translation of research findings into practice, Graeme really is one of the best in the business. So Graeme, nobody wants to hear me talk, just you. So if all is okay with you, I'll pass over. Thank you so much for coming here today. We really do appreciate it. And I've had the honor of hearing you speak on a number of occasions, a number of topics. Always enjoy it and always come away with something new and interesting. So really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Okay, and no pressure there with the big introduction, but thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and hopefully I can try and bring to life a paper that we published a few years ago now, or 2 years ago, I think, that we entitled From Paper to Podium. So the idea of this paper was, it was born through a lot of conversations I was having in the elite world, where some of the practitioners within elite sport were reading a manuscript and then wanting to immediately bring that intervention into place within that sport and environment. And often, in my opinion, this was just far too early. And that then developed into me putting this paper together, which has now developed into a matrix, which I now try and teach my students as how best to maybe read papers when looking at that translational potential. So let's, by means of a little bit more of an introduction. So you heard at the beginning that my day job is, I'm a professor at Liverpool John Moores University, and you can see in the top left, that's probably more the type of job that a typical university professor may be doing, but teaching wise. What makes my research in my world a little bit more interesting to me anyway, is I spend a lot of time trying to do my research on the office floor, so to speak. And the picture on the bottom left, you'll see me taking muscle biopsies from professional rugby players, so I can try and understand how best to fuel them. And then the picture in the middle there is me working with the England rugby team. You can see the gentleman on the right, Carl Sinclair. That was out at the World Cup in Japan, where I'm now trying to translate some of this sport nutrition research into practice. And when you're working with giant human beings like Kyle, you want to make sure that the advice you're giving them is correct, because you really don't want to get on the bad side of people like that. So we came up with this. And you can see that, this is the paper that we published in Sports Medicine back in 2019. And my co-authors on this was James Morton, who at the time was the sport nutritionist for Team Sky, the cycling team, which is now Team Ineos, and Andy Casper, who you can see on the bottom was not looking too brave holding the tackling shield for a professional rugby team when Andy was helping with England rugby. And Andy is now the nutritionist for Chelsea Football Club. So all three of us are academics who during the day are doing the research, and at some part during the day, we're trying to do that translation into practice as well. And for those who prefer a simpler read than the actual sports medicine article, the Gatorade Sports Science Institute asked us to summarize this paper in one of the exchange articles, which is a little bit more user-friendly, only a few pages, and they make much better visualizations than you can ever do in a real manuscript. And this table here summarizes the paper to podium matrix. So what is the paper to podium matrix? Well, we came up with, what do we look at when we read a research paper to try and understand, is it ready to be translated to the playing field? And I want to stress at this point that this isn't judging the quality of a research paper, because there's many research papers that would score low on the paper to podium matrix but could be Nobel Prize winning science. It's just in a sport nutrition or sport science perspective, probably not ready to implement to the applied world yet, but it's probably the cornerstone of where future research will go. So please don't think when I use examples during this talk, it's in any way criticism of the research. It's, is it ready for immediate translation? And what we decided in this paper was to come up with these 9 criteria. And we thought, well, you could judge these criteria on a simple score. And then if at the end of judging the paper, we had a positive score, we thought that that would give a good indication that this is potentially ready to guide practice. A neutral score, maybe some degree of caution needed. And then a negative score is probably it's a little bit too early. And we were talking about things like the context of the research, the participants, the research design, the controls, the validity and reliability, the data analytics, the feasibility of the application, the risk and reward, and the timing of the intervention. So what I want to do today is bring all these to life with examples from the sports science literature and show cases where actually sport nutrition has perhaps been translated too soon and in some situations has done more harm than good. So I'm going to start at the beginning and looking at the research context. And the first thing I do when I'm teaching my students at John Moores University is try and get them to understand that often there's mechanistic research and often there's applied research. And both have a really good place. And I do lots in both worlds, but I really don't want my mechanistic research to be immediately translated. And often this doesn't come across, I don't think, strong enough in the discussion, because often in a discussion of a paper, we have to almost oversell it to get it published. So really this understanding has to come from you reading the method section. So this is one example of some work from our laboratory, where we were looking at high intensity interval versus continuous running and the effects that this was having on PGC1 alpha mRNA, etc. Despite some people wanting to translate this to say that high intensity interval is better than continuous because of the effects it had on PGC1 alpha phosphorylation, this was mechanistic. This was never designed to say which is the better. This is just looking at some signaling pathways, and it was helped us to guide future studies. Well, other studies that we performed in our group, such as this one, which I'll touch on a little bit later, where we have gone into an elite rugby team, measured them at their training ground every day of the week to measure their metabolism, to try and understand how you fuel the rugby player well, would score really high, I believe, on the paper to podium matrix, where this paper on the left, if you was to score it, would score very low. So let me give you some examples. And as I said, this is no criticism of the quality of work, because this is Stu Phillips's paper, who I believe is probably the world's greatest in the protein world. And I've got more respect for this man than virtually anyone in the industry. But I want to show you how one of his papers, I think, has been translated poorly and has perhaps caused poor advice to be given to elite athletes. And I don't know how many times I've heard people say the body can only digest 20 grams of protein in one feed, which is absolute nonsense. You know, I've even heard this from athletes saying, you know, I don't need to, you know, get how much protein's in that. I can't eat it all because 20 grams is maximum and I won't digest the rest. Talk about a misunderstanding of science. And where this comes from is this study on fractional synthesis rate by Stu's group, where they showed in this specific situation that 20 grams of protein was no different, statistically speaking, to 40 grams of protein on muscle maximum fractional synthesis rate. Now, when you speak to Stu and you ask him, does that mean, in your opinion, and forget digestion, that's just a misunderstanding, is 20 grams the maximum that can ever be effective in sport? He'll say, of course not. And this has been followed up now with other studies by Stu, where they now talk about 0.4 grams per kilogram. But what you need to remember in a lot of these studies, it's acute single leg exercise using the model on the left in relatively untrained individuals. And what we know is that the response to whole body exercise, like this highly trained person on the right, before somebody became follically challenged, and yes, that was me in my undergraduate sports science days, doing some resistance training at the labs at John Moores. The response to this type of exercise is very different to the response to this exercise on the left. And I've just noticed a rather dodgy, probably fake gold chain being worn in that picture, which I can only apologise for. So Kev Tipton's come along and looked at this. And now Kevin's seen that when you do whole body resistance exercise, what you now get is a much greater fractional synthesis response with 40 grams compared with what we got with 20. But for many years, a poor translation of the Stu Phillips work has probably resulted in incorrect advice being given to athletes. Now, what we also need to remember is all these studies usually give isolated milk proteins as well. And what is emerging evidence, and this is work by Bob Wolf and his team, is that actually in the context of food rather than isolated protein supplements, there may be actually no maximum anabolic response to protein intake within the context of a meal. So now we've gone from 20 grams to 40 grams to potentially no theoretical upper limit when we actually start to do whole body exercise and eat real food, where we know that in 70 kilo students doing one-legged exercise, then 20 grams may be a theoretical upper limit. And that's why we need to translate it within context. I think a more recent example we can use is the excellent work being done, again, by great scientists, such as Keith Barr, Luc Van Loon, on collagen and casein. And now I'm hearing people saying that these are superior proteins in specific situations. So one example is that the vitamin C enriched gelatin that we've seen can augment collagen synthesis. When we look into the methods of this paper and put it through the paper to Podium matrix, we realize that the placebo group was actually a placebo, and it's not actually compared to any other protein. So do we really know that vitamin C enriched gelatin is any better than a chicken breast or some tofu or another source of protein? Does that mean I don't use this within context of England rugby? Of course not, because there is a rationale, and it certainly seems interesting. And this is me using the building blocks, as Keith likes to call them, prior to resistance sessions with our injured players within England rugby. But in a similar situation, I'm sure we've all heard that casein pre-bed is the preferential protein to have before you go to bed. And I hope the eagle-eyed here are looking at placebo versus casein. So once again, what we know is that casein is better than nothing. But is it better than food? Is it better than milk? Is it better than a whey protein? Is it better than eating a chicken breast? We really don't know. And again, when you speak to Luke, this was never meant to be a definitive, what should you be having at bed at night? It is, in theory, is casein useful given pre-bed? And the answer is yes. Is it ready to be translated like it is being done? In my opinion, no. So I said I would touch on this study, which is one by one of my PhD students, James Hudson. And I'm very fortunate that when I try and do this research that I want to be immediately translated, I often try and recruit PhD students who are former athletes. So this is James himself. So we can get a real good access to this player group. So what I asked James to do is measure the resting metabolic rate of elite rugby players every day during the week. And in a team sport environment, certainly in the UK, we tend to classify the week in relation to the game day. So you've got game day -2, -1, the day after a game, 2 days, 3 days, and 4 days after a game. And I'm sure what you can see is that most of the week, this is pretty consistent, the resting metabolic rates. But look at it the day after a game. And this was a suspicion that I had. And in the shapes of the individual players. So I know that this player here, for example, had a 1,000 calorie increase in the resting metabolic rate the day after competition. So this has had a huge influence on how we now refeed rugby players in the days after a game. What we were also able to do is look at the respiratory exchange ratio and see that actually in the days after a game, the body is crying out for carbohydrate. And in more maybe mechanistic research, but really interesting to support these observations, we did some metabolomics, and we can see that there is a big increase in protein oxidation and a big increase in gluconeogenesis. So the body is using protein for carbohydrate. Carbohydrate oxidation is increased. Energy expenditure is increased. So the body is crying out for carbohydrate, but perhaps because of some misinterpreted literature of the past, all we've tended to do is feed more and more protein. Where actually our research, which I think would score high on the paper to podium matrix, because it's real world on real athletes measured at the right time, is suggesting that they're crying out for carbohydrate. And then when I combine that with the muscle biopsy work that we've done on the elite players to measure the glycogen before and after a game, and again, I'd like to think this scores really high on the paper to podium matrix, this has resulted in immediate translation into the elite environment. So this is the dining hall at England Rugby. And what I do is I put up the menu and I put up a traffic light system for the carbohydrates. So on some days we have lower carbohydrate meals, but other days, like if this would have been the day after a game, all you'd be seeing now is green squares, and they know to eat green squares all the time. And then our post-game recovery nutrition setup, we have our repair station, protection, refuel, relaxation station, where we try and get different juices, different smoothies, and we really have a big push at trying to increase the carbohydrate and the protein the day after a game based on this immediately translatable research. Okay, so you'll be glad to know that the context is probably my longest of my 9 that I try and work my way through. The second one is the obvious one, I think, in many ways, and this is the participant characteristics. And even someone like myself who spends a lot of my career working at the elite end, I would say only 50 of my 140 papers to date have been on what I would say are genuinely world-class athletes or genuinely elite athletes. So this is an example of me conducting research within the dining hall at England Rugby. You can see the players are eating behind. The biopsy study I've talked about, you know, this was a sub 220 marathon runner that we were biopsying before marathons, pro jockeys, pro tennis players, pro fighters. So why is that important? Well, I don't mean that you always have to study the elite, but what I do mean is if you want to translate research to the elite, I believe that research must have been performed on the elite. So rather than say the research has to be performed on elite, it needs to be performed on an appropriate subject group that you now want to translate it into. So I see things like this written in papers at 6 well-trained males. Now, well-trained, trained, highly trained, for me means nothing. We need to define what is trained and untrained. And this paper did it. It said well-trained, VO2 max of 55 mils per kilogram. Now, no disrespect, but Kevin the Smurf would have a better VO2 max than this. So this really isn't a well-trained. So when you read the paper, we need to look beyond that well-trained and look at the quantitative numbers such as the VO2 max. And if there isn't one there, we need to interpret it with caution. In some sports, such as cycling, Asker Ukendrup has put this table together, which is magnificent. And what you can see here is a set of criteria where we can try and define what is trained, well-trained, elite, and world-class. And you'll see that a trained cyclist, in his opinion, should have a VO2 max of 64 to 70. So well-trained would have been 70 to 75, completely different to what we saw on that last paper. So why does that matter? Well, this data was published on Chris Froome a few years ago, where you can see his VO2 max, his peak power output, and his lactate threshold of 380 watts, which is just obscene. And if you look at the RPE, for example, plotted against the power output, at a power output of 250 watts, the RPE is only 8. 250 watts for me, I would be absolutely maxing out. This fella, you could put a basket on his bike and send him to the shops for the weekly shopping. So it's a massive difference in when you see what someone wattage is depending on the training status. And then we see papers like this, the influence of dieting nitrate in well-trained cyclists. And suddenly the huge performance increases that we've seen for years in nitrates in untrained individuals is completely different in trained individuals. Yet how many highly trained individuals think that they may be getting 10, 15% improvements based on other literature? And don't get me started on this topic about the underrepresentation of females in sports science research. So often things will just be translated. Another little pet hate of mine, and it's almost embarrassing I need to point this out, is that adaptations to exercise in the elderly are completely different to what we see in young people. Yet we do still see papers that are done to test the mechanism in the elderly translated to athletes. And I'll give you an example again from a world-class laboratory in America, the Trappy Lab. And what you can see here is in the first study I'm going to point out to you, what we see is ibuprofen suppresses muscle protein synthesis. An interesting observation in itself. In a second study, we now see ibuprofen enhancing muscle protein synthesis. So what is the difference? Get into the methods on the paper, and what we see is that the mean age in study 1 is 26. This is the one that suppressed muscle protein synthesis. The mean age in study 2 is 67. This is one where it enhanced muscle protein synthesis. So clearly something major going on between the young and the old. Now, if you was talking about resistance training for most people, certainly most athletic individuals, you would think that it would be study 1 that would be cited. Well, when you see things like this on Science Daily, over-the-counter painkillers increase muscle mass strength during long-term resistance training, study suggests. It takes a long time to read this article before you realize that this was in old people, and in young, you see the exact opposite. And then it was covered in that well-known journal, T Nation, where you get all your good sports science and sport nutrition information from, and maybe people can sense the irony there. And what you can see here is pain relievers may lead to gains. I'm pretty sure that should be spelt with a Z when we're talking about bro gains. But this is all about that study that was done in the elderly. And I'm pretty sure the vast majority of people on T Nation who want to bring back muscle from the dead and look like this fella here would be more likely to translate the research from the study on the young. So it is, again, crucial that we get into the methods of the paper and we don't take newspaper headlines. Tweets is a pet hate of mine at the moment. Twitter puts some wonderful information out, but it's a great point to start. Please don't read a tweet and use it to make a decision on what you need to do. Right, research design, the next one. The third thing that I ask people to look at when we're working out, is this immediately translatable? And the reason for this is that in a laboratory, this is how we try and do research. We get all our puppies in a row, they all feed nice and calmly. Where actually in the real world, if I was to do that experiment, it would look much more like this. And that is the world that we operate in. We try and control everything in a laboratory to make it a neat study, and then apply it to a world that's surrounded by chaos. And let me give you some examples. The example that I like to use a lot is the world of caffeine. And that is because we know by lots of great research that in a laboratory, we can work out what is an ideal dose of caffeine. So this is a nice figure drawn by Paul Greenhoff and his group. and we can see that there's this nice point here where visual information processing seems to be best at about 2.5 mgs per kilogram. Endurance performance seems to be enhanced. If we go too far, we may affect visual information processing. So let's go around about here on this sweet spot. Most of the literature that's guided that has been done in a situation like this. We have a nice, quiet and calm laboratory environment. And I started thinking one day, and it was a day I took this picture actually. This was me sat in the stand at England Rugby with fireworks going off. There's 80,000 people in the stadium. And you're thinking, how translatable is a supplement that increases our excitement, our readiness to go? How translatable is that research done in a laboratory to today at Twickenham, when I'm sure adrenaline's going anyway, heart rates are pumping? And are we running the risk of overstimulating? And the amount of times that we see more penalties given away in the start of a game, perhaps from over-arousal. Do you really need to get additional arousal if you're walking out into a stadium like that? I really don't think so. So often what I may try and do at the elite end now is save my caffeine interventions for half time, where maybe no, we do need a pickup, and I will allow the crowd and the stadium and the fireworks to be my stimulant pre-game. I also want to give a shout out to the sports science researchers who try the very best, because in our world, the perfect research design is very rarely achievable. So this is the study that I talked about right at the beginning, where we biopsied pro athletes before a rugby game. And you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 biopsy takers. We've got a team of about 20 in the dressing rooms to try and get these biopsies out. And then they went and played a professional game, and they allowed us to biopsy at the end. So you don't get much real world on this. We tried to publish it, and it got rejected from 2 journals because the reviewers said that the players didn't cover the same distance in a game. Of course they didn't. It was a proper game. The reviewers wanted us to take people off when they got to 8 kilometers so everyone covered the same distance. This is a professional game done in real world. And you're like, oh dear, okay. So we did a follow-up study and thought, right, we'll do what the reviewers wanted just to show that, you know, what happens when we cover the same distance. So this time what we did was a simulated game. So hopefully you can see that little video there where we did a simulated rugby game where we do the impacts on a tackle bag rather than a person. You can see the legs strapped up, ready to go, and every player covered the exact same distance. Yeah, you can guess what I'm going to say. When we published that, it got rejected from the first 2 journals because it wasn't a real game. So you genuinely can't win when it comes to the applied research. And all I'm saying is that when we read the methodology, read it within the context of how that research was done. Okay, the 4th one, dietary controls. What we need to look at with any sport nutrition research is what are the dietary controls. And if the diet isn't controlled, then obviously we're kidding ourselves when it comes to translating that research. So Louise Burke published a beautiful paper about a decade ago now on methods to standardize dietary intake before performance testing. And the key thing here is that it needs to be standardized, or it needs to be contextualized. And if it isn't, we've got a problem. Now, in many situations, including, this is one of my own papers, I try and pick out my own papers to criticize, so I'm not just picking out other people's. And it's not to criticize, it's to contextualize. Because this is a paper I'm really proud of when we looked at the PGC1 alpha transcriptional response to exercise in young and old people, mechanistic research to try and understand what's going on in the elderly. And you'll see here that subjects reported to the laboratory in a fasted state. So my first thing is, if you see research on fasted individuals, it's either mechanistic or it's should be studying the effects of fasting. Don't use fasted research to make a translatable suggestion to a fed athlete, because the chances are they're not going to be fed. And why do we do things fasted? Because feeding changes everything. Okay, so we need to look at that. So some examples of this is the early literature on the mouth rinsing. And what we can see is that subjects visited the lab after a 4-hour fast, having abstained from caffeine, etc. So if we want to know, is this mouth rinse still going to be effective in a real world situation, we probably want to create a more perfect environment whereby they've come in fed, we've had our pre-exercise carbohydrate gel, we're taking carbohydrate fluids on during exercise, and we might take some caffeine on board as well. And then is a mouth rinse still effective? In my experience, I can't understand when I see football players doing a mouth rinse. I don't understand why they wouldn't just drink it. With the wealth of literature that we know around the performance benefits of drinking carbohydrate against the backdrop of little literature in fasted athletes. Another example is some great work from Glyn Howardson, where they were looking mechanistically, will the polyphenols found in cherries, the Montmorency cherry brand, have any effect on oxidative stress and recovery following, so this one was a cycling exercise. And you can see here, not necessarily fasted exercise, but no participants avoiding all polyphenols, such as fruit, vegetables, tea, coffee, alcohol, chocolate, cereals. So will this still be effective in individuals who are on a polyphenol-rich diet? We've studied that in elite rugby players, where we make sure that they're on the normal polyphenol-rich diet. And contrary to this findings, we found no benefits whatsoever. So to contextualize that, if you've got an athlete who's got a horrendous diet, who doesn't have any fruit, vegetables, etc., then potentially these Montmorency cherries may help. But somebody who we've maybe worked with and got them on a polyphenol-rich diet anyway, we can maybe save a few quid here, and we don't need to implement this strategy. What I try and do now, this is Jamie Pugh, James Moorhen, some of my PhD students at the time, I try and get them to go to the supermarket and package up the food and feed them in the days building up to the exercise. So this was before our first rugby biopsy study. This was our second rugby biopsy study, where we managed to get a little bit of funding, and we used one of these meal preparation companies so we could control the food that the players were having, but we made sure they didn't go into that fasted to make it as translatable as we possibly could. Okay, the next thing I want you to consider is the validity and reliability. And particularly if you see research where they don't mention this, we need to give it a huge amount of caution. So this is a paper done by one of my colleagues, James Morton, during his PhD days. And in this study, they were using maximum force using MVC with twitch interpolation. And I think in one individual, it took 11 familiarization trials before James was happy he was getting reproducible data. Each time the data was getting better and better. So if what we see is someone hasn't had that them familiarization trials, they've just put some equipment into a sporting organization and done a test retest, then the chances are there's going to be a huge learning effect, and we need to take that into consideration. The other pet hate of mine is seeing it when it's written in papers that a piece of equipment has previously been shown to be reliable. And I use the skim fold calipers as an example. They're reliable in the hands of the person who's using it. So in someone, that piece of kit may be amazing, and in somebody else, it might not. And that's even the case for what you might think is quite simple kit, such as a simple jump mat. In someone's hands, they may get wonderfully reliable data, and in somebody else, that exact same piece of kit may not. And I remember when I was being taught statistics, the example that was often said to me is, can a Ferrari get around Silverstone in 2.5 minutes? Well, of course, or consistently within 2.5 minutes. Well, of course it can, depend on who's driving it. If I'm driving it, it probably won't get past the first bend. If an elite motor racing driver is driving it, it will probably be within a second. So that bit of kit can be very reliable in the hands of the driver. So thinking about the chaos of the applied world and everything like that, this is me, you can see me in the corner here, Jamie Pugh, doing the muscle biopsy work with using a jump mat, where we did lots of familiarization and reported it, hands on hips. We thought it was easier to take the footwear off because we had the boots on, so we could have consistent data. This is another bit of force, the exact same kit, video footage that was sent to me. Hopefully the eagle eye can see here. Hands randomly positioned, but more problematic, doing the CMJ wearing flip-flops. What type of reliable data are you going to get from CMJs in? Another thing we do in sports science a lot, and I was always taught to do this, and I'm becoming quite critical of this the older I get, is remove any external feedback. So you might see a rowing test done like this, where the ergometer feedback is taken away, which is nice in sports science research. But if you do that in an Olympic boat, the rowers will go nuts and will have absolutely no idea how to pace that trial. So in any Olympic boat, they'll have a rate meter to try and help them with the feedback, and that's how they will judge the race. And a friend of mine who's an Olympic rower blames losing a world championship race on the rate meter failing. And it failed, so they couldn't pace the race and they got it horribly wrong. So if Olympic oarsmen can't pace without some external feedback, what chance have we got in a sports science laboratory on students? So I actually think we should be giving them feedback, and I'm happy to have that discussion at a later date or at the end of here if people disagree. Okay, the next thing I wanted to cover is the data analytics and the presentation of the data. And this is a review article published in the European Journal of Sports Sciences on Does Fat Adaptation Improve Performance by Jeff Follett, Tim Noakes and Stephen Finney. And I feel partly responsible here because I was a handling editor on a special edition of this journal. And what you'll see presented here is the mean data at baseline and after 4 weeks of a ketotic diet, where we can see endurance at 65% of VO2 max increased by 4 minutes. So when you look at that data on that table, you might just think, well, 4 minutes is pretty good, and I'll take that on a ketotic diet. So that's one way that data could be presented, 147 against 151. It looks magnificent. But let's present it in what I think is a more genuine way. That's the actual data that I got from the paper, where 2 people did better, 2 people did worse, and 1 stayed the same. It was on 5 people, and the whole reason for this big increase is this one individual here who had a huge increase. So perhaps that's the better way that data should have been presented, rather than just giving a mean within a table. So we really need to look beyond how the data may be presented and look at it in a bit more depth. And this is how I now this is some recent data that I've published, how I now try and publish data, where I show in sports science style research, the mean and the individual responses, usually because we're quite low end in sports science related research. Obviously we're getting to much bigger end, than means and standard deviations, etc. are better. But I think where we can see the individual data is a huge advantage. I said we got faster if we worked our way through them. So the next one is the feasibility of the application. And in the paper to Podium, we put this model together where what we suggested is that if we want to be green practitioners, and by that I mean striving for transformational improvements, we need 2 things. We need research and innovation, but we also need application. So there's no point having amazing research if actually we can't apply it. And likewise, there's no point just applying the same thing if we've not got any research and innovation, if we're trying to get transformational improvements. So we need to think about the feasibility of the application when we're reading the sports science literature. So one example here can be just comparing two simple, well-known sport nutrition interventions. So one being omega-3 fish oils, and I costed up, building up to the Rugby World Cup, what it would cost to give the amount of fish oil I needed to my squad for a year based on the research from Chris McGlory. And it came out at around about £24,000 for the team. So in terms of the feasibility of that application, I just not got that budget, even at the elite end. Whereas something like creatine, around about £1,000 per team, then it's a really feasible application. Another example can be the brilliant research we've seen over the years on beta-alanine. Well, what we know with beta-alanine is it must be taken daily for a number of weeks. We need about 3 to 6 grams. If you're working with people who are soft and don't like the tingles, we need to get it under about 1 gram, don't we? Or with food or whatever, or we need the slow release formulas. So potentially 1 gram a day, 6 times a day for 8 weeks. And I've found that in some sports like football, that's almost impossible to get the players to do. Whereas a sport like rugby, the players will do that no problem. So what I'm saying is that the feasibility of the application will be in the hands of the environment you're working with. So in one situation, it could be very feasible. And in another situation, it might genuinely think, that's probably a step too far for this culture at this time. Risk and reward is another one. And an obvious one I'm going to mention here on the risk and reward is the CBD. And that's because I'm doing a lot of research in CBD. Yes, there's growing literature that it may help in terms of recovery, but the anti-doping risk is absolutely through the roof, and is something whereby at the moment I don't think it's there. Well, maybe a better risk and reward strategy could be the buffering of either the bicarb or the beta-alanine. I mean, if we think about the bicarb, the risk and reward here, we need to think about the risk of gastrointestinal discomfort. And in some situations like rugby, I often make the judgment call that because of the timing of the intervention, and if you do get a GI discomfort mid-game, it's a problem because of the timing. I probably won't. But when I work with elite rowers, all over it because of the risk and reward is suitable. Where the risk and reward of the side effects of beta-alanine, just being a tingle, I'm all over it. For me, there really isn't much risk there to the great reward of using it. So we're always needing to think about things like that. Another example of risk and reward, maybe you've seen this paper, high rates of muscle glycogen resynthesis when carbohydrate is co-ingested with coffee or caffeine. And I heard a well-known sport nutritionist on a podcast who works in the UFC saying that because of that, you must give caffeine with your carbohydrate. When you read the paper, it's 8 milligrams per kilogram body mass of caffeine to get that effect. And if you think that a lot of exercise at the elite end is done at night, do we really want to be given 8 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine after exercise to help with glycogen resynthesis, when actually you probably want your athlete to sleep? In my hands, I really, really don't. And the final one is the timing of the intervention. And I didn't have the timing of the intervention in my paper to Podium until I submitted it for review. And I think I know who the reviewer was, but it was a great suggestion by the reviewer. But it's also something we should think about. So one example here is that we know that when you read the headline here, that chronic ingestion of L-carnitine with carbohydrate will increase muscle carnitine and alter fuel metabolism. Great. But it's 24 weeks of daily supplementation. Now, in some worlds, and with high carbohydrate, to actually get an insulin response as well. So some worlds, that might be an appropriate timing. Other worlds, you might. So for me with England Rugby, I get my players in camp and then 2 weeks later we play. So I've not got an ability to do a 24-week load. And another example could be whenever I hear people who criticize the work of the likes of Louise, who's shown that a low carb, high fat diet actually impairs performance? The argument always comes back is that you've not done it for long enough. And I've seen studies now out to about 6 weeks that are still showing impairments in performance. So how many weeks would we accept impaired performance for at the chance of, at best, no change compared with a high carbohydrate diet? I just imagine that conversation of me with my boss at England Rugby, Eddie Jones, saying, I'd like to put our players on a 6-week low carb diet. Training and performance will be down for the next 6 weeks. It might be okay in 6 weeks' time, but we're not sure yet. It might be a hard sell to the coach, given that in most pro sport environments, you lose 3 or 4 games on the run and you're sacked. So we do need to think of the timing. And that's it. That's my paper to podium matrix. So if you was to go through a paper like that and tot it all up, you would come up with a score. And then when you've got that score, if it's a real positive score, you'd be like, okay, right, I'm pretty sure I can use that. And if I was to summarize this presentation, I would say that applying results from the lab isn't as easy as it sounds. You know, people think it's a really easy thing to do. And often you hear a conditioner might have seen a tweet, they've seen, oh, someone's done this paper, let's change everything. But often that study hasn't been done on it's not been done on the appropriate participants. It's not been done in the context that we need it in. We must look beyond the literature to help guide our practice, or look into it, sorry, not beyond it. And we need to look beyond the title, the abstract, and especially beyond the tweet. We cannot get our information in 140 characters or whatever it is these days on Twitter. When reading a paper, I would encourage everyone to spend most of the time in the methods section. That's where we work out, is this translatable? Where lots of people read the last couple of sentences of the abstract. Once we've decided that, yeah, this maybe has a place in our hands, I would encourage everyone to conduct our own in-house research then. And by that, I mean, bring the strategy in and see if it's effective in your scenario. If it is, great, you've got a new intervention. And if not, let it go. It's not translatable to you. Move on, look for something else. Just because something has been shown effective in a paper doesn't mean it's going to be effective in your hands. And in my experience, by doing this, it allows me to simplify my nutritional interventions and really focus in on the 2 or 3 that I'm really confident is going to help to deliver winning performances. So on that note, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Hopefully I'm not going on too long. A big thanks to my team at JMU, who've done a lot of the research when I've showed my own research. And at that point, I'm more than happy to see if I can answer any questions that anyone may have. So thank you very much.
Graeme, thank you so much. That's fascinating. There's just so much to unpack there. I'm here scribbling all these notes and wanting to return to a lot of my papers and designs to maybe take another look at some things and how I've been phrasing things. But I think there's just a huge amount there. Guys, while we have Graeme here, what way do you want to do questions? If people want to put in the chat, I'm more than happy to read them out, but also please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask yourselves. I see Brian has popped the camera on there, so that generally means Brian's about to jump in with a question. So yeah, go for it.
Sure, if I may. Hi, Graeme.
Hey, good to see you. Well,
yes, I see you're well. Thank you very much. A great talk. I've watched a few of these where you talk about your paper to podium before. And myself and Emer even took inspiration from it in a kind of journal club module that we had here at the university recently. Plenty of things to sort of pick your brains about, but I want to ask your opinion on sort of the dietary controls in studies. Because, you know, sometimes I go back and forth, and obviously, you know, I fully agree that it's important to control these things, but sometimes I also wonder, are we then sometimes controlling it too much? Because people's diets will vary from day to day prior to games. And I guess, you know, obviously you have experience with the rugby lads. I don't know how rigid their dietary routines are before. So should we maybe strive to try to allow people to do their normal routine and then just analyze it afterwards and see if there were huge fluctuations? What are your thoughts on that, maybe?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question in that world, isn't it? Do we over control it, and then exactly as you say, risk not doing it, or do we try and put that control on? And I don't think there's any real right or wrong answer to it. I do like the idea of in some situations allow them to follow the normal diet, but monitor it and record it. And I do like in a repeated measures design when to do, that's what I would use in that design, where I ask them to do the normal diet, record it, picture it, but just then replicate it on trial too. If I'm doing a study, like for example, the rugby carbohydrate one, where we wanted to see the effects on carbohydrate and muscle glycogen, well, in that case, we needed to make sure that there was enough glycogen to start with. So in that situation, what we did was we got all the athletes in and we was asking them what is a typical 24 hours preload for them. And then we tried to do a diet that was as familiar with what they were going to do. But you're exactly right. We can be in danger of doing that. And, there's a paper where on the validity of snap and send of a good friend of mine, Nessun Costello. And when we look at that one, that's where maybe one example where Nessun knew what they was eating and then got them to do a food snap and send to send it back to check on it. But actually by knowing what they was eating, it kind of killed the purpose of what we were trying to achieve in the study in some ways. And when we repeated that study by people not knowing what they were eating, we get a completely different set of data on the validity of the snap and send technique. So yeah, I think there's always a balance between that. And I guess it comes back to what is the main question you're trying to answer.
Yeah.
Can I follow up on that question a wee bit? Graeme, do you have any thoughts on how do you define what's meaningful? In terms of, I suspect, I love your picture of the puppies all lined up in a row and then the puppies in the real world. I suspect if we make our research designs, if we kind of more representative of real life, it'll be very hard for the small effects that we might expect with some of these supplements to actually emerge from all the noise that's going to come in. And then I kind of think, our type 2 error rate then is suddenly going way up because we've got a noisier environment, but at the same time, that's the real world. Do you have any thoughts on when to decide what's meaningful, what are we accepting or not?
Again, I think the reason why yourself and Brian are asking these questions is because you probably know there's no answer. And don't think I'm going to help you out of this hole here because there really isn't. That's why I like in the type of studies I do, looking at individual data. Because, if 7 of the 8 people all move in one direction, then whether that is a second increase or a 10-second increase is almost irrelevant. They're moving in that one direction. If people are moving all over the shop, then again, and the mean increase is 20 seconds, but everyone's moving all over the shop, almost so what? So I think in the sports science world, almost opposite to what I was taught as an undergraduate about focus on means and standard errors and p-values and all that. And I've gone back now to eyeball and individual data. And when you try and come up with what is a meaningful difference, well, in the elite end, it's impossible to say, because I don't know if you saw, I think it was one of the stages of the Tour de France, there was no difference in seconds whatsoever between the top 10. So 0.00001 of a second was meaningful in that situation. And as we know, and I'm looking at, Brian and the work he's done on the bicarb and beta-alanine and the buffering, like 4 seconds, I've heard people say, is what that can potentially be for a 2K row. Well, 4 seconds is the difference between winning an Olympic gold and not even making the final. So in that world, a 0.5, you think about Steve Redgrave's last gold medal, 4 to finish, made him a history maker for, that getting that gold medal in that 4th Olympics. and you're literally talking an inch, 0.1, 0.2 of a second. So what is meaningful, who knows? Again, it's very, very individual, but that's why I do like looking at individual responses within research.
Can I just ask another question about kind of populations? And I guess, you touched upon, obviously you work with elite populations. So for you to look at the literature and look at, as you showed, less well-trained individuals, I was a bit disappointed when you said that, because my VO2 max is around 55, and I was hoping to be considered.
Mine's not even that, Brad. Mine's not that, don't worry.
But obviously, I would say, that obviously there's not that many elites in certain sports, obviously, and then whereas sort of, I suppose, competitions exist at all kinds of levels. So
correct.
What is your opinion on, like, where should we put a limit? Should we kind of say, well, at a competitive level, we should be starting to look at, include people, volunteers who are maybe competitive, but not sedentary, because then it makes it almost irrelevant.
Correct, yeah, and maybe I didn't emphasize that enough, and it's a really good point. What I was trying to get at that point is to make it relevant to a population you want to use it in. So what I mean by that is, if there's a paper done on something on Chris Froome, chances are that's might not be that helpful for a club level cyclist, and likewise research done on a club level cyclist might not help someone like Chris Froome, but research done on club cyclists will be great for club cyclists. And I guess what I'm saying is, look at the population you're working with and look at the research you're using and say, right, okay, is that in a similar population? And if not, could it affect things? So, I use the beetroot quite a bit, because when that came out, people were talking about 10 to 15% improvement in performance. Well, that's how you break a 2-hour marathon, just give them beetroot. But suddenly people didn't start smashing a 2-hour marathon just because we had some beetroot, because we know at the elite end, everything's like, but it might give them a couple of seconds. And as we know, that might be important. So yeah, I really still think there's a place for doing research at all levels, from untrained to highly trained, from young to old, across the different genders, without doubt. It's just what I was probably trying to emphasize on that point is just be careful. And like I use that ibuprofen example, the T Nation article showing that ibuprofen increases strength gains is in old people who've probably got a chronic low level inflammation permanently, and they've maybe helped with that, and that's helped the strength gains. But if you've not got that chronic low level inflammation, then and actually that's quite dangerous. You think a bodybuilder seeing that, next thing you know, they're going to be popping ibuprofen and going to give themselves stomach ulcers for research that was never meant to be translated to them.
I think that's an interesting point. So, but for something like the Boston Marathon, where you have people qualifying, so they're, recreational, but competitive. And so they're giving out information, right, about ibuprofen, but you have people running it, right, like pretty fast 2-hour marathons. And then those of us who are aging, you have people in their 60s, 70s that are still competitive. So just something like that, like, and I was trying to look up, because I thought it was like, I wasn't supposed to take either Tylenol or ibuprofen, right? They had this thing, like, you shouldn't take it the day before a marathon. But I think your comments, that can get really interesting on the information that the BAA is giving out to all of us that are running that race and are very interested in, right? Like, I'm interested in shaving off 4 minutes. Like, I'd be thrilled.
I'd be happy to just complete one of them, being honest. I'm a former rugby player who's got no body left anymore. So, but even the thought of running a marathon brings me out in hot sweats.
I don't have the excuse of a former rugby career, but I also don't think I'd make it. Does Gaelic football count? Graham, do you have any thoughts on where is the best place? I feel like there are certain people, yourself, James Morton, Trent, Louise, who are kind of just the best in the business at this translation. I think a lot of us tend to be quite good at either the research side or the translation or the more practice side. And there's a real struggle sometimes to bridge that gap. Do you have any thoughts on where or strategies to bridge that gap? Is it on the people who are very much practitioners? Do they need more research training? Do the researchers need more science communication training? Do we need a third category to kind of go in the middle? Like, how do we practically get this?
You know, not everyone needs to do it. You know, there's a massive place for researchers to do brilliant mechanistic research and don't necessarily have to try and get it on. And I hope that, I know I'm not coming across this is the only way to do this type of thing. I think there's a huge place for people who don't. The way I do it is by making sure that the elite organizations that we do get something back from it. You know, and we're not just using them as guinea pigs for the sake of it. It's got to be a two-way street. So, you know, we do a lot of stuff with marathon runners where we'll get them into the elite scene, but they'll get the fat max and they'll get all the different metabolic testing they want done that can help them. So relationship building, and I just seen a word that Vanessa's thrown in the collaboration, absolutely spot on. You know, that's the secret to it, whether it's you collaborating with sports teams or whether it's, you know, people who can do amazing mechanistic research collaborating with me, who can then get into the biopsies off the athletes and send you some of these biopsies to analyze, etc. I think it's relationship building and collaboration is a secret without doubt. But like I said, don't think everyone has to either. You know, there's a massive place for wet science, you know, wet chemistry scientists who can do stuff I could only ever dream of.
Guys, I think we're right up on the hour there. I'm conscious of time, but if anybody has any kind of last comments or questions, we can kind of go now. Otherwise, I think we'll need to wrap up because we're on our time. I think, Graeme, I want to talk about this all night, and I will probably continue this conversation with Brian for the rest of the day and week. But just want to say a massive thank you. Fantastic talk, so much in there, and really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you very much for inviting. If I can be any help, people can feel free to reach out to me and I'll do my best to answer over email, etc.